Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I would like to talk to you about how the airline industry has pledged to reduce its carbon emissions. As I'm sure that you're all aware, the global community is now working hard to reduce its carbon emissions in order to prevent further global warming. There is quite a lot that households and industries are already doing in terms of green technologies and more efficient households and industrial processes. But one of the major industries that has seen phenomenal growth in the last couple of decades is the airline industry. I'm sure there are many of you listening that will have taken a flight in the last few months. Whereas in the past, many of us only used a plane to travel long distances, more and more of us are using a plane for medium and short-haul destinations. The airline industry's contribution to global warming can no longer be ignored. At the 2009 Global Warming Summit in Copenhagen, a lot of attention was focused on what the airline industry was going to do. In advance of this summit, in September 2009, the aviation industry made a rather dramatic pledge. Their pledge was that they would halve carbon emissions by 2050. Of course, reducing their CO2 emissions will have quite a significant effect on the aviation industry as a whole. It is going to increase airfares and is also going to spark a green technology race amongst aircraft manufacturers. This means that these manufacturers are now going to have to start making much more efficient aircraft. The chief executive of British Airways, who is a member of the International Air Transport Association, which is the governing body for the airline industry, the chief executive of British Airways, Willie Walsh, was the man who unveiled this agreement. The agreement had been made between the airlines, airports, and aircraft companies. And as I mentioned, this agreement was that the aviation industry has pledged to cut emissions to 50% below 2005 levels by 2050. Until this point, environmental groups had been clamouring for higher taxes on aviation. And the airline industry's response to this has been a bid to seize the initiative from environmental groups. So this aviation industry plan was presented to world leaders at the United Nations Forum on Climate Change in New York, as I say, in September 2009. And I would just like to present to you with a list of the proposals that the airline industry have put forward. They have agreed, firstly, to reduce net carbon dioxide emissions by 50%, 50%, by 2050, compared with 2005 levels. Secondly, they have agreed to make all industry growth carbon neutral by 2020. Thirdly, they have agreed to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 1.5% per year over the next decade. And lastly, they've agreed to submit plans for joining a global carbon trading scheme to the UN by November 2010. Now, these proposals were accepted by the UN, and they were discussed, and they were on the agenda at the Copenhagen Global Warming Summit later that year. This was a summit where world leaders hoped to agree carbon emission reduction targets. So this pledge to reduce emissions by 50%, it actually goes further than the British government's target. It's quite a radical step that they're proposing. The British government's target was simply to limit airline emissions to 2005 levels by 2050. So a 50% reduction is quite a dramatic change. Now, the presentation to UN delegates on behalf of IATA was viewed by climate change campaigners as an attempt to avoid punitive measures that could have been imposed on the airline industry. Many airline executives were very fearful that the airline industry in particular would be singled out because at the moment it's excluded from any restrictions. If I just elaborate on that, it means that there are no caps on CO2 emissions in the airline industry. In other words, airlines are not included in the 1997 Kyoto Protocols. Willie Walsh, the Chief Executive of British Airways, said to the UN, "International aviation emissions were not included in the Kyoto Protocol 12 years ago. Now we have a chance to rectify that omission, and we must seize it. Our proposals represent the most environmentally effective and practical means of reducing aviation's carbon output. They are the best option for the planet, and we urge the UN to adopt them." If I can just elaborate slightly on these proposals, what it would mean is that the airlines would leave the EU emissions trading scheme, which they're currently a member of, which they are due to join in 2012. So they would not join this trading scheme. Instead, they would buy carbon dioxide permits, in other words, trading permits, in a global market. Willie Walsh had warned earlier in 2009 that joining a global scheme would add around £3 billion per year to industry costs. And of course, these costs will be simply passed on to passengers in the form of higher fares. According to the European Commission, the EU trading scheme, so carbon trading scheme, is believed to add about €9 or £8.16 to the cost of a return short-haul flight, or €40 to a long-distance return flight. And it's not clear what the cost would be when airlines join a global market, if they join a global market. However, obviously lots of environmental campaigners were listening to this statement. It was quite a hot topic, and they weren't convinced. They suggested that this new pledge by the aviation industry was undermined because it simply relied on the industry funding emission cuts elsewhere. And what the environmental campaigners can see is that the aviation industry will achieve these reductions, these carbon emission reductions, by offsetting and by buying carbon credits. The director of Greenpeace, for example, said that it just shows that the aviation industry is not really taking the issue of climate change seriously at all. If we look at some statistics, at the moment, aviation accounts for 1.6% of global greenhouse emissions. But if it continues to grow unchecked, it will become the biggest emitter in the developed world. The British government's advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change, warned ministers this month that aviation will soon account for a quarter of all emissions in the developed world. So even if it caps 2050 emissions at 2005 levels, we're still talking about a lot of carbon emissions. This committee also recommended that the British government carry out investment into green technologies for aviation. As I mentioned earlier, cutting the aviation industry's emissions will require quite significant advances in aviation technology. And if these advances are not achieved, it would simply force airlines to make up the differences in their carbon emissions using carbon trading or offset markets. In other words, if they don't manage to make greener airlines or greener airplanes, then all the industry will do is just fund other green technology in other industries. If we look at how airlines are situated financially at the moment, it's not a pretty picture. IATA estimates that globally, airlines will lose $11 billion this year. Obviously, that's not a very healthy financial state. So having them join in with this carbon permit system is also going to put them in a more difficult financial situation. But I'm sure we all realise that airlines are not going to go away. And I feel that we as passengers have it in our power to put pressure on airlines to encourage them to become more environmentally friendly. And this is already happening at a fairly basic level. Certain airlines, when you buy a ticket online, you're also able to purchase a kind of carbon offsetting tax, which is supposed to offset the environmental damage of your flight. But environmental campaigners do seem to think that this is glossing over the main point. And the main point is that the airline industry itself has to look very carefully at their technologies. They themselves have to become greener. There is a danger that if they don't do this, that all of the efforts made in other industries will be counteracted by increasing emissions from airlines. So we do wish them the very best in their pledges. Thank you for listening.